All right, good morning, everybody. This is Celeste Carmichael, Program Development and Accountability Specialist with Cooperative Extension Administration. I want to welcome you to the Building Campus County Connections webinar series. Today's topic is Community Energy, Research and Education to Spur Innovation. So we're really excited to have today's program. We've got a lot of folks involved, and just to give you a hint of background, if you haven't joined the Campus County Connections webinars before, they were sort of the brainchild of the integrated program and research team here on campus. So that's folks that work in program of Cornell Cooperative Extension and also the applied research program here on campus to think about programs that really have a very rich campus and county connection. So working with research that's going on campus and folks that are doing programs out of campus, and also that where those programs cross over into Cornell Cooperative Extension educators and staff working with communities. So today's program is a great example of that. And I'm going to, at this point, turn the slides over to Rod Howe.
Thanks, Celeste. This is Rod Howe, Assistant Director for Cornell Cooperative Extension for Community and Economic Vitality, and Executive Director of CARDI, the Community and Regional Development Institute. And I'm really excited that there's this partnership between CARDI, Cornell Cooperative Extension, and really the Community and Energy Program Work Team to support community and energy education and outreach. And what we wanted to highlight today was the importance of linking innovation and research and technical assistance with education and outreach around a few different energy scenarios. We're not suggesting that these are the only energy scenarios that play out at a community level for which CC associations want to pay attention, but these are the ones that were presented at the Association of Towns Conference earlier this week. Sharon Anderson will not be with us today, but David Kay is here, Guillermo Metz, and Alan Zender. So for a couple of the topics, we're only going to just present just a few slides because the presenters won't be with us, and then there will be two areas which we will go more in depth. So we look forward to you adding your questions as we go through the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to David Kay for a couple of minutes.
Next, please.
Okay.
So, yes, on behalf of Sharon and myself as co-chairs of the Community and Energy Program Work Team, thank you for joining us today. This is just a quick slide to suggest what it is we're trying to achieve with this. Fundamentally, it just disappeared. Can we go on to the next slide here? Not you, but me.
Oh, okay.
I just couldn't see it for a second. So, as Celeste was basically saying, we're just trying to basically help build connections between campus faculty and people out in the counties to give a better sense of who's doing what. There is the potential, hopefully, for partnerships that might lead to future funding around some of these topics if you're interested in them. Very specific goal of today's presentation is to share some of the material that Cornell faculty and both, again, on campus and off campus in some of the counties were able to present at the Association of Towns meetings just earlier this week. And hopefully some of you may have the opportunity to follow up with each other on an interpersonal one-on-one level. And finally, our general interest in our program work team, and I think to some extent in CARDI, and the theme of this particular presentation is focusing in on the community approaches to energy as opposed to a lot of other work that we know goes on that really focuses more on individual decision making. So we'd like to, in that context, hopefully a couple places along the way, be able to get some feedback from you and share some ideas and see what's important to you all.
And we certainly have the attention of NYSERDA, and we are even strengthening our connections with NYSERDA, perhaps especially through the Cleaner, Greener Communities initiative, So keep that as a backdrop as we go through some slides. So next, Celeste. And Guillermo, I'm going to feel free to chime in on these slides, Guillermo. So Guillermo and I are going to just try to give you a quick overview of two of the topics covered earlier this week at the Association of Towns conference. So the first topic was focused on transportation issues. We know that sometimes transportation is one of their major energy users. So Paul Mutolo, who is with the Energy Materials Center at Cornell and the New York State Center for Future Energy Systems, you should view him as a resource. You'll see his email address there. So what we conveyed at the presentation was just a couple of things that he's involved in right now. One is that he was asked to work in Rhinebeck, New York, and we did involve Cornell Cooperative Extension of Dutchess County. They wanted to explore their options for different alternative fuel vehicles and had a particular interest in thinking about their trash and converting that to use in their vehicles. And with any of these things, I think one of the messages that Paul makes is that you really have to sit back and do an assessment, that there's several, first you have to understand the context, what are the goals of a particular municipality, what's some of the historical context, and what are the opportunities? Are people ready for either new practices? Are the local officials ready to explore different technology options? And with many of these issues, there's an education and outreach component. So that's why, you know, if nothing else, I think we're trying to emphasize throughout today that there's this great partnership between those who are doing the research and the innovation and extension educators who are there on the ground to help with the outreach and the education piece. Well, one of the things that Paul is able to do through his center is to work with municipalities on really doing an analysis of their transportation needs, not just from an economic perspective, but from an energy use perspective and an environmental perspective. I think I'll go through the next couple, Guillermo, and then you can see if there's anything that you want to add on. He talks about this Paul Mutolo talks about this well-to-wheels analysis. And again, if you are working with anyone in your communities who, from a municipality level, who wants to be exploring some transportation issues, I would contact Paul Mutolo. It might even be that you set up a conference call so that an educator's on the phone, your local municipal leader's on the phone with Paul to walk through and understand how do you do some sort of well-to-wheels analysis. Do you want to go to the next one, please? One of the things that he is working on in Tompkins County specifically is to bring a hydrogen-powered bus to be part of the Tompkins County Area Transit's fleet of buses. So this will be an innovation that I think will require some education. I think just when people hear the word hydrogen-powered fuel, there might be some misconceptions. It might just raise some things in people's minds that we need to provide some further education around. So it's an exciting opportunity, and certainly it's got benefits that you can see listed here. I won't read through them, but it's also providing an opportunity to provide some infrastructure for other vehicles that may come down the pike that will be hydrogen operated. So this innovation is leading to perhaps a broader adoption of this technology by other members of the community. And certainly Paul can talk about the technologies behind the hydrogen conversion. I think this is the last slide before we go on to the next. So I'm going to see if Guillermo wants to, actually there's one more slide, but Guillermo, before we go on, is there anything that you want to highlight about Paul's material?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Hello? Hello? Hopefully you can hear me. What I think Paul really wanted to point out, as well as what the trucks, the buses, the cars are running on, is where that fuel is coming from. And I think that was one of the main points that he wanted to get across, is that these fuels can be produced locally. The hydrogen, the methane, natural gas can be produced from waste. So I think that was a major point to look at when you're looking at the full system. Traditionally, a lot of what people have looked at is what we're going to run our fleet on, but not where that fuel is going to come from. And there's a huge opportunity to use some of the local resources like garbage, like it was pointed out, for actual fuel production that these buses and cars can run on.
Thank you, Guillermo. And here, again, is a way to contact Paul, and it suggests what some of the research resources are through EMC Squared. So again, my guess is that many of you are not familiar with this part of Cornell, nor Paul. So this is, if nothing else, an introduction, and he would be very open to hearing from you. We're going to now go on to do a similar brief overview of geothermal. So this was presented by Jeff Tester, who is with the Cornell Energy Institute here on campus. He's also affiliated with the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future. We work closely with Jeff on Sustainable Communities initiatives, and he is one of our key partners in strengthening the partnership with NYSERDA. His main message is that geothermal energy holds a lot of potential, that it's underutilized here in New York State, and that he hopes that it becomes more thought of as a potential energy scenario by New York State communities. He thinks that there's huge potential for thinking about it, not only for individual buildings, which we certainly know is happening, but also for district heating systems, which could be a downtown area, it could be a campus. Certainly I know it's being talked about for parts of the Cornell University campus. So a collection of buildings that could either be kind of a Main Street downtown area or some sort of campus environment. If any of you have had the opportunity to talk to Jeff, normally it takes him only about 10 minutes before he mentions Iceland. He had actually several slides on Iceland in his presentation earlier this week, and they have completely transformed their energy system by going almost totally to geothermal. And in fact, he's planning on having the president of Iceland come and speak at Cornell in the next few months. So I didn't include the slides where he does a comparison of Iceland and New York State, the U.S., but he thinks there's enough similarities that Iceland is something for us to take a look at. Celeste? You can read, he's got a report here. Guillermo, I'm going to stop for a minute to see if there's anything that you want to chime in on the geothermal and what you consider any of Jeff's major messages.
Yeah, just that he made the distinction, as you mentioned earlier, that the geothermal systems come in sort of two classes, that they're the heat pumps that a lot of us are starting to become familiar with in terms of space heating for usually buildings rather than district. What he's talking about here is tapping a hot layer within the earth, digging sometimes a few 1,000 feet, sometimes several miles down to where you get a hot magma layer almost, or an area where you can actually circulate some water through and either have temperatures that you can be seen once it comes to the surface, or at least what he was mentioning is if it's just for space heating, it's something like 150, 160 degrees that you want to circulate. So that's not too difficult to attain in a lot of cases, and that will save you a lot of fuel if you can just circulate this hot water or antifreeze to a building or an area.
Guillermo, cover a couple more slides on this, but see the question from Jeff Miller and think about that to see if you have a response while I go on to the next slide for a minute.
He actually can't see that because it's sent.
Oh, okay. I'll tell you the question in a minute. So the next slide just shows you that according to Jeff's analysis, there is certainly the potential for geothermal direct use. And then the next slide is his summary comment. So I'll leave this slide up that you can read through. Guillermo, the question from Jeff that I guess you can't see the questions is there greater energy efficiency of using methane to fuel bus versus using methane to generate electricity? Do you have a response? If not, David has a bit of a response.
Right. So I guess this goes back to Paul's talk. Efficiencies of fueling a bus on methane or to generate electricity. The electricity, so if you're talking about whole system efficiencies, yeah, the efficiency for electricity transfer is, there's still a lot of line loss, and that's something like 30% no matter what you generate that electricity from. I think Jeff's main point was let's get the methane locally sourced. It's not so much where you use it as an end source, as an end use, but if it can be locally sourced from garbage or anaerobic digestion, then you're increasing your efficiencies and your potentials exponentially. So you'd have to do a full analysis of what you're looking at in terms of energy for buses or electricity, I think, and Paul could help with that.
Right, and I think that's one of the messages that this is an area where it's sometimes the answers aren't easy. You really have to step back and think about the various variables, if you will. We're going to pause to make sure you're awake and with us and do this little poll here.
So you should see up on your screen a poll's popped up. So if you could take a moment and just participate in that, that'd be great. I know a lot of folks have participated on webinars before, and we've seen a couple of messages come through chat. So just know that you can ask questions anytime by using the chat feature.
And partly we put this in because, of course, we didn't do these justice at all. It was really just whetting your appetite, if you will. So we wanted to see if this is an area that we need to provide some additional information, which we could do through fact sheets and other things, working with Jeff and Paul. So it looks like generally there is some interest. Some of you feel you've got enough that at least you could make a connection. So say you were approached by a local official about geothermal, you would at least know to perhaps try to connect them with Jeff Tester. So thanks for that. Okay. Now we're pleased that we do have Alan Zender with us, who was in New York earlier this week presenting on community-scale wind energy. Alan is a professor in mechanical and aerospace engineering. So Alan, I'll turn it over to you, and I think Celeste is giving you...
Passing the ball.
Passing the ball.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Rod. Thanks, Celeste. I've got the ball. So, good morning, everybody. I'm Alan Zender from Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. I'll just briefly talk through a little bit of what I presented in New York on Monday, and please stop with any questions. I might add that at the discussion in New York, I also had Marguerite Wells, who's the manager for the Black Oak Wind Project, which is a developing project in Tompkins County, sort of a community-scale wind project, and I think she would also be a very good resource, very much more on the practical side of things. So what I talk about a little bit is kind of wind energy at the big scale. At the end of this, I have a list of resources that might be useful if you have to deal with wind energy questions. And Rod, how much time do I have approximately?
12 minutes or so.
Okay, got it. So first slide I put up here is why wind energy. I'm thinking, why am I excited about wind energy, and why are other people excited about wind energy? And certainly one of the key drivers is concern over climate change and, just the massive amount of pollution that we're putting out there in terms of CO2, as well as the other known hazards and so forth. And everyone's familiar with the big water pollution problems that just happened in West Virginia as a result of coal mining and coal use. Another interest that people have, though, is the diversification of the energy portfolio. People call the wind as a free fuel, which it is. You put all the money up front to build the turbine. And I plotted there in the middle the dollars per million BTU of natural gas over the last 20 years. Is very variable, spiky. It's cheap now, trending upwards, and nobody really knows where it's going to be. And in a lot of sort of statewide level interest in wind energy has to do with the potential jobs associated with it, because this is something that's pretty sort of capital intensive. You've got to build these turbines, maintain them. It needs a lot of people for all elements of it, the research, the installation, the maintenance, and so forth. So a lot of interest around jobs in wind energy. And the United States just has tremendous wind resources. It's really too much to ignore. So we could power the country 12 times over with the wind resources that we have. And nobody's talking about powering it 12 times over, maybe 1/5 or 1/2 or something like that. So it's completely within reach to have significant wind energy nationally and in New York as well. So this is what I talked about in New York, just some real basics. Maybe I'll just skip to the middle there. One thing to keep in mind is that the power that you get is going to go up as a cube of the wind speed. So a change in wind speed from 10 miles an hour to 15 miles an hour, that's a big change in terms of the power you get out. So you want to be where it's windy, which means you want to be in the right locations in the state. You want to have tall towers to get up where the wind is higher. If people are talking about wind energy and they say, hey, we're going to put in a 1 megawatt turbine or 2 megawatt turbine, just keep in mind that that power will only be achieved when the wind is blowing at what's called the rated speed, which is typically around 25 miles an hour or 10 meters per second. And of course, the wind doesn't blow that hard all the time. So if you look at the average power that's produced, that's called the capacity factor. And in the Northeast, that capacity factor is about 1/3. So if you've got a 2 megawatt turbine, on average, you'll get about 700 kilowatts of power out of that, at least around us. And also, you can't put these one next to another. You've got to space them apart because one turbine will leave the other guys in a sort of a wind shadow. And so they've got to be spaced sort of 5 to 10 rotor diameters apart. And in here, I've got some pictures of, this is not exactly to scale, but of, on the left, the sort of residential wind turbines, 10 kilowatt kind of range, more community scale. This Northern Power Unit is on a 100-foot tower. And then the ones that you see, in many places are more industrial scale, like this GE 1.5 megawatt turbine. And I put on the next page a comparison of that GE scale turbine to a 747. And, these turbines are big. And they don't look so big because you kind of see them from afar sometimes. But if you have a chance to go, up close to the turbines, you'll see the size scale of these. So when you take that and you space it 10 turbines apart, you realize you're talking about sort of 1,000-meter spacing between turbines. Something that isn't very well known is that electricity from wind is cost competitive. And what I'm showing here is at the national scale. So the sort of blue-gray band there is the range of national wholesale electricity prices each year. And the dots are average wind energy prices over the years. And they've come down quite a bit in recent years. And so right now, wind energy is sort of competitive with the highest end of electricity prices. But any movement in natural gas prices will send that national curve upward again. The costs in the Northeast are a bit higher, though, because the capacity factor is lower and just other expenses are higher. But nonetheless, you've got a lot of activity in large-scale wind energy, even by people who are also in the game of generating electricity by coal and by natural gas and other means, because they want to have hedges against the variability of electricity from gas and other sources. So in the state, I'll just talk a little bit about that. The Renewable Portfolio Standard requires 30% of electricity come from renewable energy resources next year. That includes wind, hydro, solar, and so forth. We already have quite a bit of hydropower in the state already. By my estimate of different resources assessments that I've seen is that we could generate about 50% of our electricity from wind onshore in the state if we wanted to, sort of exploiting the wind resources that we have at a reasonable scale. And you could get up to 10% with really no changes to the grid. We have enough grid to integrate quite a bit of wind energy already. Right now we're only at about 2%, so there's a long way to go. Nationally, the picture is the same. You could integrate up to about 20% wind energy nationally without having to make big changes to the grid, or to have storage, which is another sort of misconception. Okay, so that's my, now we're at the poll here, I see. So should I stop?
We already did that.
Oh, okay. So I just skip over?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, I didn't realize that was interspersed. So I just showed here a map of some of the projects, wind energy projects out in western New York, where you get a lot of wind in the lee of Lake Erie, and then in sort of central New York at Center, you know, these areas east of Syracuse, Maple Ridge up east of Watertown, which is in the lee of Lake Ontario. You know, those are places where there's a lot of wind, basically, and that's where you want to have your wind projects. If just a resource that I found really useful when we've talked about wind energy is this New York State Small Wind Explorer. So if anyone's coming to you and saying, hey, you know, you think it makes any sense to have wind energy in our area, you can look at this Wind Explorer and sort of zoom in on an area, and it'll give you average wind speeds. Average wind speed doesn't tell you everything, but you know, if the average wind speed isn't up over, I don't know, you know, 10 miles an hour or something like that, you're not really going to have a very good shot at economically producing wind energy. So that's a good resource. And then, so just in the end here, I've listed a bunch of other resources that listing of wind project, wind resource maps at the small scale, lower altitude, higher scale, for higher altitude, for you know, industrial scale turbines. And then there's all kinds of issues around review, siting, permitting, studies you've got to do, financing. And the NYSERDA Wind Energy Toolkit I found was very good. It kind of steps you through how to do it, basically, and what all is involved if you've got to deal with the wind energy development.
And just so folks know, we did post this information sheet to the CARDI website. So if you go to the CARDI website and go to our community and energy section, you'll find this information flyer and all 4 presentations that were done at the Association of Towns conference. So just so you know that. Alan, I know you may not stay with us for the entire time, so let me just ask a question, because I know that in some places in the state, wind energy has been as controversial as natural gas hydrofracking. And we also know that there's, in the public discourse, there's a lot of what seems to be misconceptions about wind energy. Mm-hmm. So do you want to just address what you've heard as some of the, oh, but you've got to worry about bats, and you've got to worry about flicker, and you've got to worry about this. Do you want to just quickly say something about what's out there in the general public's thought, in some cases, of wind energy?
Sure. Yeah, let me just take them one at a time in no particular order, but you mentioned bats and birds. So that's something that I've heard when we've given public presentations here in Ithaca. Hey, what about the birds? You're going to kill all the birds. Well, you're going to fry the planet if you don't do anything is one way to look at it. But another way to look at it is that the number of birds killed by tall buildings and by household cats is orders of magnitude higher than that killed by wind turbines. And there are quite a few studies on that as well. And so if that comes up, you know, I could point you to pretty definitive studies on that subject. A lot of that bird concern came out of the earliest projects out in the Altamont Pass in California, where there were smaller turbines running at higher blade speeds. Towers were built with truss structures that birds like to nest in, so they were nesting, in pretty dangerous spots, and there were localized, significant kills of raptors in the Altamont Pass. So another one you hear a lot is the noise, and I think that's not to be dismissed. You certainly don't want to probably live right next to a wind turbine. You want to be some distance away. And then there are sort of sneaky things that you can't really assess. So infrasound is a low sort of frequency sound that you can't hear, that people complain that gives them health issues and so forth. And there's quite a bit of evidence that where people have heard about infrasound, they have health issues, and where they haven't heard about it, they don't have health issues. So it doesn't really seem to be real, but certainly you've got to be aware of it and be able to address it. There have been studies on property values. Some people say, oh, you're going to put a turbine, you're going to kill my property values. But the Lawrence Berkeley Lab has done pretty definitive studies showing that there are no negative impacts on property values. And in fact, if you are a farmer and you've got a wind turbine on your land, you will reap royalty payments, and the area will also reap tax payments as well, typically. So they're, if you've got a turbine on your land and you're getting paid for it, you'll be a lot happier about it. And then there's concern about the shadow flicker. So you're sitting in your living room and you've got this sort of shadow flickering across your field of view every few seconds. And that can be completely calculated. You know where the turbine is, the angle of the sun, and so forth. And so, if that comes up, then calculations can be done, and it can be assessed, like, is this really a problem or not? It might only really hit somebody's living room window for a few hours a year or something like that, but at least they should know that. What else? Setbacks, people say, well, the thing is going to fall down on me. So you don't want to have a house right under a turbine. You want to have enough setbacks so that if there is a problem, it won't hurt anybody. And there are problems. Turbine foundations fail, blades fail every once in a while. But at least they're localized failures. You're not polluting the whole water system like they did in West Virginia with their coal. You may be, taking down some corn or something like that if the turbine falls down in some farmer's field. So I think those are some of the main issues. I think just generally also there's sometimes like a pushback against these as being sort of corporate projects and being dumped in people's backyards, and the way in which developers go about communicating with their local communities is really important. In the local case, it's going to be community owned, and there's a lot more buy-in, I think, because of that community ownership.
Thank you, Alan. That's great. We're going to move on now to the solar energy presentation. So Tobias Hanrath was there. He's an associate professor in chemical and biomolecular engineering, and Guillermo presented with him. So Guillermo is going to cover this next segment. So I think you might want to turn it over to Guillermo, Celeste.
Okay.
Do I have control of slides?
Yes, you do at this point, Guillermo. Do you know how to move them forward? There's a little arrow up at the top of above the slides, and that's how you have to move it forward.
Okay. So thank you. Tobias really presented this first part, but I'll run through it kind of quickly. They wanted to get a sense of the basic forms of solar energy, and some of the ones we're familiar with, solar photovoltaic or PV, those solar cells that we see on rooftops or out on a ground mount system, basically make electricity. Fusion, as he pointed out, might be something coming down the pike in 50 years, 100 years, that we could actually capture something that the sun is doing and giving us all of our solar energy. Solar fuel in the form of biofuels. All plants are basically collecting solar energy and turning it into other usable fuel forms of energy. When we burn wood, et cetera, we're releasing that energy again. And in some cases, if you think about it, fossil fuels are also this kind of fuel that's just been processed over millions of years and harnessed from deep underground. And then solar thermal, which is the heating of water. You can also make electricity by heating that water to a level where you can turn a turbine with it. And You can also just heat domestic water, or domestic hot water with the sun. The availability, some folks really don't realize just the amount of solar energy hitting the Earth at any one time, but the amount of sunlight incident on the Earth in 1 hour is more than enough to supply the global energy demand for 1 whole year. The issue is that it's inherently intermittent, so there is nighttime everywhere, and it's also relatively dilute, so that the amount of usable energy is significantly less than that. But if we were to look at solar potential around the U.S., you're looking at kilowatt hours per meter square per day, and if you go toward the red zone on the left, down at the bottom, those are the higher numbers, and the blue and purple are lower numbers, so less energy from the sun. And there you see a map of Germany superimposed on the U.S. And Germany has about the solar potential of Alaska, actually, but their adoption of solar is the highest in the world. So it's really not so much about how much sun we're getting as we are getting plenty of sun in our area. Certainly you can see there in New York State that we have fairly good solar potential, certainly compared to Germany. I wanted to point you to a resource here, the PV Watts. This is developed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where you can go to this website. If you Google for PV Watts, it's a calculator. You can see those circles in red showing you the size of the system, the DC ratings that you were to plug in, your expected size of the system you're thinking of putting in, and the array type, whether it's fixed tilt or tracking. And the program will give you the other necessary components. So it will tell you basically what degrees, what angle to tilt your panels at, and so forth, and some readings on your actual solar potential in your area. So you can see that the conversion factor, the D-rate factor for Syracuse in this case is 0.77. So 77% of the sun's energy is usable there in Syracuse. It's quite high.
Guillermo, the poll before we go to this slide?
Sure. I don't see a poll, but go ahead.
Does he have to turn it back to you?
I think, can everybody see the poll right now?
Can you see the poll?
So if you can just take a moment to participate in the poll. Yep, all right, great. Thank you.
So, Guillermo, I think this sets you up for your next slide.
Thank you. I wasn't sure you had that, so thank you for that, Rod.
Can we do the other two polls, just so you know?
Great, thanks. So if we've had a chance, if folks have had a chance to fill that out, the poll has ended. Now we can see the actual amount of solar as a factor of the total U.S. energy sector is actually 0.006%. So quite a few people got that correct, 23% of you. So that's good, but it's somewhat sad, I think, that such a tiny amount of our total energy is coming from PV at this point. Basic motivations for adoption of renewable energy. We've traditionally been hammered with the fear of peak oil and CO2 emissions and climate change, and I think these are good driving factors sometimes for getting us to do the right thing, and certainly they are valid. We can get into more details of what peak oil and CO2 emissions are doing or what they mean, but certainly renewables are a way to alleviate our reliance on fossil fuels, which are the major contributors to climate change. So the other way to look at it is as an opportunity. There are a lot of opportunities in renewables and specifically in solar. Commercial deployment of solar PV, if you look down at the bottom, since 2000, there has been quite an increase, an average of 65% annual compound growth for the past 5 years in the adoption, deployment of solar in the U.S. And if you look at that as far as installation, we are increasing quite rapidly. The installed percentage, there you see the pink is the European Union, and the U.S. is about 10%, with China in green at 12%, Japan at 13%. So out of the total deployment, most of it is still in Europe, but the U.S. is catching up. Manufacturing, most of the manufacturing is occurring in China at this point, but you can see just 5 years ago, it was a much smaller percent, with Japan leading. The U.S. it has a small sliver there, but actually some companies are moving back to the U.S. in terms of manufacturing. And let's do the other poll now. With most PV, most of the innovation occurs where? Most of it is made in where? And proportionally, most of it's installed where? This slide gives you a hint, or gives you the answer actually for most of where it's being made. But over here we look at it as, you may have guessed, the vast majority has been invented or innovated here in the United States. So most of the patents are coming out of the U.S. still, but it's being manufactured in China and deployed in Europe. Germany specifically has the highest deployment in the world. So many of you got that correct. It's the U.S. is still leading in innovation. Now, electricity production in Germany, this is a really interesting day in history, July 7th of last year, where the total amount of electricity being made from solar was higher than the amount of electricity being made from anything else in Germany on that day. So solar was actually cost competitive, it was market competitive in every way, and being utilized at a greater level than any other source of energy for a day in Germany. Some of the costs we look at, this chart is very busy, but on the left side, that is a workflow diagram for PV installation. And while the costs are coming down for the manufacture of cells, the costs, the balance of systems, or BOS costs, are something else that needs to be addressed. And some of that workflow is where we can bring some of those other prices down. But the major cost reductions over the last decade or so have been really in manufacturing of the cells themselves. Let's look a little bit at impacts on New York State solar. You can read through this slide quickly. And this, the slides are going to be available, and the webinar is going to be available. So you can take a look at this at your own leisure later. But we are the 12th state in the country in installed solar capacity, powering about 30,000, almost 31,000 homes. So it's not incidental in New York State. Looking briefly at what is a solar cell, it can be compared to a battery. You have a cell, many cells make up a module, and several modules make up an array. The 10 by 10 centimeter cell provides about 1.2 watts typically, and a cell voltage of about half to 0.6 volts. And then you connect these in series to create a module, and those in strings. So as you can put batteries together, you can create more power from the system. A few case studies. What you were talking about residentially, typically 1 to 10 kilowatt systems up to about 20 kilowatt. Commercial, typically on rooftop, would be 10 kilowatt up to about 1 megawatt. And utility scale, that is putting that power back into the grid at 1 megawatt up to 500 megawatt scale. And a couple of examples here in the Ithaca, Hopkins County area. Eco Village, this was installed, it is up and running. And it's a system that you can see after significant rebates, we were able to drop the cost from about $230,000 to about $94,000. So that's a significant area where you would need to look at what the state, federal incentives and rebates are. But this is sort of an example of total cost of a significant sized system here. And another that's under development, a 10-acre site right by the airport. You can see that landing strip there in the lower quadrant is the airport, Tompkins County Airport. They're looking at putting in to that orange outlined area about 6,700 modules that would provide about 2.5 million kilowatt hours annual production, which is about 1% of the Cornell University campus use. But it would provide also $190,000 annual value savings annually. Briefly, I want to run through some slides for the Solarized Tompkins program. Solarized is gaining a lot of traction statewide and even nationally as a program to boost solar adoption. And here in Tompkins County, we tried this in 2013, and the challenge was that the transition to renewable energy wasn't happening fast enough. So the other factor we were looking at is that Tompkins County, even though it's a leader in solar adoption in New York State, there was still less than 1% of the homes had solar power systems. That should be looked at with the caveat that 1% of total housing, out of that total number, really a small percentage of that is actually suited to PV installations. So it cuts that number significantly. But still, the total amount of solar has not been realized as far as potential. So if we look at the poll again, what are the three main barriers to the broader adoption of solar according to this Solarized program, which I'll get into a little bit what that is. The Solarized is a national model. So if you have a chance to fill that out.
And Guillermo, we once in a while, if you may be turning your head. We lose you just slightly once in a while, just so you know that.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll, but if you're on, you'll have a couple more seconds here, 20 seconds to chime in with your answer.
Okay, so I'll go on to the next one. The challenge here in Tompkins County, we were looking at, we really wanted to increase the rate of solar power development and reduce reliance on fossil fuels. How do we do that? So we were looking at these programs that identified some of the issues with why people aren't going for more solar. And really, price is one of the main factors for a lot of folks. Too many choices was believed to be one of the significant factors, and lack of technical knowledge was one of the factors. So several people got that correct. How do we address that? We looked at the Solarized program, which basically is to enact a limited time program to promote solar, increase the annual rate of solar installs in these 3 towns. We developed it for Solarized Tompkins Southeast. I'll get into that. It's 3 towns of the county. And it'll stimulate the solar market and create momentum that'll carry over so that we can change the perception of solar power to be the new normal. And so addressing those 3 barriers, price, too many choices, and technical knowledge, the Solarized program and Solarized Tompkins Southeast overcomes costs by community purchasing. So we gather a group of people together, we enroll them in the program, and we can provide both discounts and a bidding process with tiered pricing depending on how many people enroll in the program. That gives reduction in cost to the installers. They can buy these panels in bulk. That'll drop their price, and they also are being handed these enrollees so that they don't have to go out and find them. It overcomes confusion in the ability to choose, because typically with these solarized programs, vet an installer or a couple installers, and it's a limited offering. So the enrollees have really very little to think about, and this is what you are being offered, and if you like it, here you go. And then it overcomes lack of technical knowledge, because the organizing group provides education and community discussions. We coordinate workshops where we gather folks together from the community and explain the offering and explain really what solar is all about. And at the end of it, you go home and you think about it and decide to act within that limited time. So it overcomes some customer inertia, and folks did act. In Portland, where the model was first started in 2009, in just 3 years, they ran 6 campaigns and added about 1.7 megawatts of PV on 560 homes. I'd urge you, if you're interested, to look at this guidebook. There's the URL down at the bottom. Provides some brief case studies of other solarized programs nationwide. And this is the Solarized Tompkins Southeast program. The Southeast because it was these 3 towns, Dryden, Caroline, and Danby, that got together to run the program. Enrolled about 300 folks, and it resulted in 106 PV contracts signed. About 10% of those have been installed for a variety of reasons. And we also, in our case, included solar thermal, so solar hot water systems, and we installed about 38 of those. So to recap, basically an organizing group screens contractors through an RFP or request for proposals process, organizes town hall meetings or workshops, and promotes the programs and registers the interested enrollees. It's important to note that all the final contracts are between the contractor and the homeowner, but the organizing group helps with pre-screening, promotion, getting large groups of residents in one place at one time, and locking in the reduced rate through bulk purchases and tiered pricing. So we were able to look at a price structure where the year before, in 2012, the price per watt was about $5.50, $5.50 per watt. The price given to us by the installer was $3.05 per watt after we met certain tiers, which we did easily meet. And so the installed price after incentives and rebates was about $3,800 for a 5.2 kilowatt system. So it dropped the price down to below $1 per watt.
Guillermo, there's a question about will the installation rate crash if the federal and state rebates are not continued after 2016?
I don't think they would crash. I think that there would be some reduction. The idea of rebates and incentives is that they go in and they work on an industry that needs help, and then they get out. So with the price of solar coming down through manufacturing and also hopefully some of these balance of systems costs coming down, the price will become cost competitive with other forms of energy on its own, so we won't need the incentives anymore. That's the idea. Obviously, the fossil fuel industry still gets incentives, and so it's debatable, but I don't think taking them away will crash the whole system. I think that certainly they're helpful. They are very helpful at the moment, but they've been going down. So, for example, the New York State rebate a few years ago was $4 a watt. Now it's at about $1 a watt. So that's just the direct rebate that the state gives, and that's only in about 3 years it's come down significantly. So the idea is that they will come down, but hopefully they'll stick around for a little bit longer.
And I have a couple more questions, but I'll wait till you get through your next couple of slides.
Okay, quickly, the lessons learned are quite important to think about. That the three-pronged approach of Solarize is effective. So if you were to do the education outreach, the bulk purchase, and enrolling folks, and this RFP process to vet installers, that is effective. But I would really urge communities, now that we're looking at doing a countywide program and scaling it up, we are running into some concerns that it can hurt other installers if you give that amount of work to one installer or even 2 installers. And we believe that there are ways to make the program work even better if it's opened up. So I would urge you to think about other ancillary effects that you might be having by adopting this kind of limited program, and not try to hurt some of the installers who've really worked hard to create the industry in the area. And always the first order of education really should be about energy conservation, reducing your loads as much as possible. So at all the workshops, we really presented information about reducing not just electrical loads, but heating loads, and really conserving energy first. That's where you're going to really save the most money and energy, obviously, and then you'll have less need for a significantly sized system.
Great, Guillermo. A couple more questions before we go into the final segment. There was, and Alan may have, if Alan is still on, he may have to weigh on.
He is not on anymore.
Okay. So one question was, how does solar PV costs per unit compare with wind for homeowners? Total cost, payback period. You may or may not be able to answer that.
Yeah, well, I can. It really varies. Solar, New York State-wide, it's a lot more site-dependent. So if your site is not shaded, then you have the same amount of sun as somebody a mile down the road whose site isn't shaded and has the same orientation. But with wind, it is more site-dependent. So a lot of folks think they have a good wind resource. As far as homeowner-owned wind, the systems require more maintenance. You really have to have a good resource. So it's, I would say, harder to get a wind system that really works for you. And like I say, it takes more maintenance over time. The turbines are basically warranted for about 10 years. They last about 10 years at the most with maintenance. So the costs can be more, but if you have a good site, you get a lot more energy out of the wind than you do from the sun. So it's really a balance, and it can be quite specific to a site.
Thank you. And we're going to put a poll up while David Kay answers this other question. Why is the EU so far ahead of the United States?
Well, of course, I don't know the full answer to that, but I could say one thing, and it does vary from country to country in the EU, but the simple answer is favorable public policies that have led to more favorable economics. So from the decision maker's perspective, they're ahead of us in terms of sort of the calculations of what it makes sense to do. And a lot of the reason they're ahead is there's been various kinds of legal and pricing policies and subsidies that have made it very attractive.
So we have, I think this might be our last poll. So if you want to answer this poll, and then we're turning it over to David Kay for the wrap-up.
So, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to close the poll. You got 20 seconds to just chime in and give a response.
Sure.
And then it'll close up. So you get a couple of responses there.
Okay, I'll assume, make a wild assumption, which is undoubtedly incorrect, that all the people that didn't answer are actually conflict avoiders. They didn't want to commit themselves, but they didn't want to create conflict by saying that. So this. I'm just going to really introduce a few ideas. This is obviously not the time and place to go into any depth into any of these things. We do whole workshops around these kinds of topics. But I think one of the things that some of us, at least back when we were young, were a little naive about was that there would be no, everybody would be in favor of all the things that we thought were good ideas, the direction that society needed to go. And for better or worse, I think that we'll find that with renewable technologies, while there may be less controversy in some cases, or the kinds of controversy that were maybe different, it's not the technology itself that will save you from controversy itself, and therefore I think in many cases we need to be prepared for it and think particularly about processes that are able to anticipate and to some extent embrace controversial topics. Particularly as we go to scale with some of these technologies, they'll become, I think, more rather than less controversial because they'll become a big deal affecting lots of people rather than small deal affecting a few people. So getting ahead of the curve is basically the message, and education has a very important role to play in how to do that. So some of these notes are from my colleague Sharon, who can't be here with us today because of illness, but you know, education, I think, about the technologies themselves is almost always important because a lot of these are new to most people. People don't really know exactly what we're talking about, and we already heard a number of references to the fact that when people don't know something that's new, then they start filling in the gaps with a mixture of information and misinformation. I'm going to talk in just the next slide a little bit about the issue evolution cycle, but just one thing for educators to, not yet, one thing for educators to be aware of is that, you know, paying attention to sort of how long this issue has been around in the community you're working with, and that there's phases of development in general of issues that have implications that should be thought through about what kind of educational interventions you might take. And we'll get back to that in a second. Sharon sent me several just examples that she has worked with where around public issues, a couple of them around energy topics, and Guillermo just mentioned one in Solarize, where they really hadn't necessarily, some where they had anticipated conflict and some where they hadn't anticipated conflict very much. And I think her bottom line prescription, if you will, for how to make how to make it as constructive as possible is, I'm just going to read one sentence she sent me. We identified key stakeholders for outreach, and we were transparent, sharing all the information we had as we gained it. So the idea of getting building relationships ahead of time, being open with what you know, and it's really, a lot of it is really about developing relationships of trust where there's good communication going back and forth. And I think you'll see down under the tips that, key issues there are be proactive, get ahead of the curve before the controversy is on the front pages of the paper, and you'll be much more effective if you've established relationships with some of the key players before the issue is even on the table. So you can work with a basis of trust to start with. So that has implications for who you spend your time with and who you think of as your audiences. And she also mentions just trying to think from the perspective of using the community and economic development model, and I'll just mention, if we go on to the next slides, a couple of the things I'll come back to very briefly. So this is, for those of you who have been in the extension system for a long time, this might be familiar. For those of you who haven't, it might be old news. It was very popular in extension in the 90s when Alan Hahn, who used to be at Cornell, was promoting this idea. And it's obviously a very complicated chart. I'm not going to go through it other than if you look at the middle, you see that in that circle in the middle that he highlights, it's a little mechanical, the arrows can go all different directions, but he highlights that there's a lot of different stages that communities typically go through, starting with concern, development of an issue, making decisions, and then trying to implement them, and then evaluating what's happened. That's a little more linear than reality, but the main point is like trying to think about where you are in a process, and then the important part of that is, depending on where you sort of assess things are in the community, you're probably going to want to try and have different kinds of educational interventions. And so he adds some of the possible kinds of interventions and things you might think about doing around this. Again, maybe we can move on to the next one. Here's a kind of a different take on the same idea from the International Association of Public Participation Professionals, which is an interesting organization to know about in the first place. And could you hit the return, because I think there's some arrows that pop up. So again, this is the idea about, in the scale that's being shown on the top, this is about what is the intention really, what is your intention and goal in terms of public participation? If it's to inform, you're going to probably use a different strategy. If you're doing something like creating a citizen jury, where you're actually saying, we're going to implement policy based on what you tell us you want as a group of citizens. So maybe one more slide. So at the bottom, again, the important message, and you can look at this in more detail or come to a workshop when we put one on these topics, but the important thing, again, to highlight is that there are different techniques and strategies to use depending on what your goals are in terms of your educational intervention. And, around community issues, there's often some relationship to policy that you're talking about, and it's particularly important to be thinking about and explicit and clear about what it is you're trying to get in, the reasons you're trying to get involved, people involved, the public involved, and to make sure that they understand that as well, and that you're using techniques that are appropriate for that. So can you next one, please? We can go on. This is actually from our website. I mentioned earlier about sort of having a community and economic development frame of mind as you're thinking about these things. So these are just CARDI's version of what we try and do when we think about community and economic development and how we build capacity and how we try and educate around these issues. And I think that, with not going through these bullet by bullet, but I think the thing that I would want to highlight here is the diversity of types of things that are up there on the one hand, and in terms of our goals, and secondly, how it's not strictly about providing information. That's our first bullet up there, is really about providing, synthesizing information for people. Almost all of the other ones there are really about various versions of relationship development, mobilization of resources, promoting collaboration. So there's a lot of different kinds of things that we're trying to work on in order to improve our effectiveness. And we're not saying that every educator would be doing all of those things, but that your awareness of the kind of environment, the broader kind of environment of possibilities of interventions and capacity building would be a very good thing to develop and help make you more effective. This is some examples that Sharon put in here of specific ways that they in Tompkins County and other places have worked on trying to establish relationships with local officials. And I'm sure you could all come up with a lot more, so these, I'm not going to go through these either, but this is just to prompt your thinking about, assuming you buy into the idea that developing relationships with local officials is important, and in our community energy context we would assert that it is, then here are some ideas of how you might do that. And there was also, just again in the context of our program work team, some mention about the DEC's program on climate smart communities. So I wanted to throw up here something as a reminder that there are quite a few communities in New York State who have already signed on to this pledge that's designed and administered by our Department of Environmental Conservation. The most important thing you do if you're in one of those communities, this is a community decision, not an individual decision, but those communities have pledged to combat climate change by becoming a climate smart community, and then what they're talking about they're actually doing is in bullets 2 through 10, and there's some resources about that, and I see Rod wants to add something.
So this is really a NYSERDA DEC partnership, and we were specifically asked by our NYSERDA colleagues in the Cleaner, Greener Communities Initiative that they thought extension might help get the word out to communities, because they've been somewhat disappointed by the number of communities, municipalities who have signed on to this pledge. So, I think it's totally fine for extension to bring this to the attention of its local officials.
Right, and we have discussed, although not committed, about maybe doing some more educational events focused on what this is all about.
Right.
So if you're particularly interested in that, let us know. I'm going to go into the next one. Rod just mentioned NYSERDA, and we have been, as a program work team, we heard that one of the things that might be good to do would be to try and more strategically develop a relationship between campus, our cooperative extension offices, and NYSERDA. So there have been a number of things we've done to try and follow through with that, and I think we are actually being successful at building a stronger relationship now. And one of the things we've learned in doing that is that NYSERDA envisions itself, with the support apparently from the governor on down, in trying to restructure the way it works in pretty significant ways, which will, NYSERDA, like many bureaucracies, has a reputation for being very bureaucratized and in silos, and they're really making a concerted effort to take a more holistic effort to try and address community needs, breaking down the walls of silos.
So we know we covered a lot of territory. We wanted to give you a smattering of things that we covered with your local town officials. Earlier this week at Association of Towns. We hope that many associations do want to engage with their local officials in helping them sort through what their renewable energy options are, but we know it's a process. There's technical assistance here back on campus and some targeted areas to help with that. So I want to thank Celeste for helping us pull this off. So we do want to just, before we end in a couple of minutes, just see if there's any last-minute questions. Guillermo, thank you for all your work and for this presentation. So we'll hang on for a couple minutes to see if there's any questions.
And if you have some questions and want to type those in, I'll just take a moment to plug the upcoming Building Campus County Connection webinars. So we typically try to do these once a month, but once in a while we get a request from a group that's excited and wants to add one to it. So and that's how our community and energy. You may have noticed that you got 2 for February, and that's because we had too many good things going on. So March coming up is economics, evaluating the economic impacts of food hubs. And then we have influencing childhood obesity prevention. And so there's a number of, from April through June, topics are focused around youth and 4-H youth development. So we hope that you can join us for some of those. And the idea is that these Campus County Connection webinars are relatively short. You can be listening with one ear and still get a little bit of insight on some of the good things that are going on both on campus and off campus.
Well, with that, I think we'll. So thank you, everyone. Guillermo, did you want to say any last word there?
No. Thank you. No, thank you.
So thank you, everyone, for participating today. We will be sending the link to the recording out to some others who weren't able to join us today. So thank you very much.